So, Lilo and Stitch came out, the live action one, and it's a hit. The film has outgrossed its original within the first week of being out. It has topped the Thunderbolts. It's outpacing other Marvel films people actually wanted to see initially. And it looks set to dominate the marketplace without any opposing family-friendly films in theaters right now. I mean, you have the Minecraft movie, but that's in month 2, month 3 of being out? It's not much of a competition. I don't think it's a surprise Lilo and Stitch live action is a hit. I mean, Lilo and Stitch has always been popular. Well, at least it was after its initial release when it was kind of underperforming and then became a big marketing push for Disney. I digress. But a lot of online critics were heralding the end of the live-action Disney era following the disappointing release of Snow White. But a lot of people knew the truth. We were ending the cycle. We were just transitioning into a new phase. Regardless of criticisms of Lilo and Stitch, it's proven incredibly popular. For those of you who don't know or don't understand why, I'm about to get into that. Let me get into a little bit right now my feelings on Lilo and Stitch, because I have seen it. I think the movie is fine. It's a good family-friendly film with some nice family-friendly messages, and while they are changes from the original that I'm disappointed by, I don't think that it really destroys the whole, like a lot of online critics seem to be saying it does.
Lilo and Stitch is a remake travesty.
A lot of people, I was looking at some reviews of this movie, and they think it was some travesty. It was as though Stitch jumped through the screen itself and pooped in their popcorn. But that's not really the case, is it? The best you can say is it's inoffensive for the most part. It's a family-friendly little romp. We used to get movies like this all the time. Back in the 90s and 2000s, this is the kind of movie you would pick up from the library, at your local library, when they used to have VHS tapes there. And you'd spend it with your family watching it for the night, and you would watch it, have a good enough time watching it, and then when you returned it, you'd forget the name of it. It would be a vague memory you come back to years later. Lilo and Stitch is like that, except it had a big budget. Well, relatively big budget. The movie is actually cheaper to make than most of Disney's recent live-action output, including Snow White. We'll get to that later as well. But the movie itself is fine. The characters are charming enough. The plot flows at a decent pace. I'm not here to tell you it's the worst live-action Disney film, because that would be a lie. It's not even the worst live-action Disney film this year. There is one big change, of course, which a lot of people have discussed. I don't want to spoil it too much. I don't like that change. I don't like how they adjusted the plot to reach that change. There's a neighbor character who you know exactly what she's going to be doing and what role she'll play from the moment she shows up. They are side characters from the original who are kind of pushed to the side more, despite there being more length to the film. I don't like how they switched out the child care service person from Bubbles to Nani's voice actress from the first film. I don't like that change because I feel they made this threat way too soft, way too comforting, and as opposed to an existential threat to the family that it represents in the original film. Everything involving Nani losing custody over Lilo is the biggest weakness in the film by a mile. Everything else is fine. Not all the acting is all that great, but that's okay. It's charming enough. It's a good enough film to watch with your kids if you have, because there's nothing else. We'll get to that later. I keep harping on that, but we'll get to that point later. There's nothing else really in theaters right now for families. This is the best thing for families in 2025. Because there's nothing else there. But we'll get to that. Don't worry about that. Overall, film's fine. I think anyone online who's hyperbolically reacting to Lilo and Stitch, like it's the worst thing ever, you're being hyperbolic. This isn't a travesty. This isn't the worst thing to happen. It's just a movie. And it's just a fine, whatever movie. It's not as good as the original. But then again, what could be? Of course, I do find one thing funny. For years, we're being told how woke the new Snow White was. But Stitch is a story about illegal immigration on an island ravaged by colonization, featuring a cast of people of color. Lilo and Stitch is ranking at Evo, while Snow White is pulling DSP tier combos into games of wokeness. Don't waste my time with woke as the reason Snow White failed versus Lilo and Stitch. That's not even a factor. In fact, it kind of proves the opposite. That go woke, go broke is actually inverted a little bit. The more woke it is, the better it gets, apparently. Who knows? I don't know. What are you going to do? So don't waste my time with that kind of nonsense. That's not going to factor into this discussion at all. Rather, I can cite 3 key details why Lilo and Stitch is a hit for Disney and reshaping how their live-action adaptations will go moving forward. And these 3 reasons are thus: minimal risk, the proper amount of exposure, and no competition. Let's work on minimal risk. First off, Lilo and Stitch is one of the least expensive Disney live-action adaptations around in the past 15 years. Previous adaptations like the original Jungle Book, which no one talks about, the first 101 Dalmatians adaptation, they were lower budget films, more mid-range budgets. But over time, as CG became more prominent in the filmmaking process, Disney began to rely on special effects to communicate their story rather than plotted, thought-out sets, cohesive scripts, and what have you. Snow White is a good example of this, where a lot of the film was scrapped or reworked to patch up arguments between the creatives and the executives in Snow White. They would at the last minute scrap what they have and rework it with CG to kind of hide the changes that they made along the way. Fix it in post. It's more expensive that way. It adds to the budget. It means all the time you spent having the animators work on certain scenes, it gets scrapped and they have to rework from scratch. That requires a lot of effort. It requires new models, it requires new animation, it requires everything, cohesiveness. And that's kind of difficult to do at the last second. It costs money. And Disney is an expert at making sure that special effects people rework all the stuff they have done so they spend more money on it. Case in point, She-Hulk. Good example of that would be She-Hulk with the muscle shrinkage in that whole show. But Lilo and Stitch, very clearly, they had a plan, they had set shots. The special effects are minimal. There's a whole character, the whale alien guy. He gets removed from the movie, presumably, to cut costs. Jumba and all that, they have human forms now. Again, to cut costs, to avoid animating Jumba in every single shot. And what actually works about it is when the special effects are on screen, it actually looks better. Bizarrely, the crazy alien creatures look more realistic than the dwarves. Something we've had in film for years somehow looks faker than these outlandish aliens. That's not to say that Lilo and Stitch is cheap, but because they more carefully planned the shots around the effects and didn't deviate too much apparently, it's more successful. Lilo and Stitch, alongside the Thunderbolts, operates as lower budgeted big budget films. Not quite mid-budget, which is more the $100 million range, but not as overly expensive as Snow White or many of the other Marvel films before that. Captain America Brave New World also followed this principle, to the film's financial benefit, though that film suffered from changes and re-edits, along with the inclusion of a new character in the form of Carlo Esposito's villain. Ironically, I think the cheaper Thunderbolts and Lilo and Stitch both look better than the vastly more expensive The Marvels did, or Snow White, because they worked the effects better into the script, giving the artists more time to polish their work for less money. Disney has always gotten in their own way, forcing creators to change and adjust their work as the films are being produced and sometimes after they've already been filmed. I suspect the smoother development helped make the movies cheaper. If Disney keeps it going, the threshold for success will lower, resulting in higher revenue for the studio. Spend less, which means you have less of a risk and more of a chance to turn a profit. There's also the proper amount of exposure. It may be wild to hear this for anyone who lived during the 2000s, but Lilo and Stitch as a brand is currently somewhat underexposed, outside of plushies and all that. For a decade, they gave Stitch TV shows, multiple sequels, a manga and anime even. But after the nostalgia establishing boom, we haven't seen too much of Stitch outside of the merchandising branch of Disney. And even all of that extra material is far more easy to overlook in that zeitgeist than, say, Aladdin, Beauty and the Beast, or The Lion King. But The Lion King and Aladdin, they had their shows, their sequels, etc., and they kind of remained ever present in discussion. We always talked about them. They were always around in conversation. Discussions were being had about Robin Williams' contract with Disney for years after Aladdin came out. Whereas Lilo and Stitch, it felt like a smaller, more inclusive little club. People who loved it could find something that they liked about it, but it didn't bombard general audiences the same way that those core Disney Renaissance classics did. And that's distinct because it allowed audiences to kind of miss Stitch, to kind of forget about him, but still remember him fondly in nostalgia. This is opposed to Snow White. Snow White is often heralded as one of Walt Disney's greatest works, yet simultaneously, few people will call Snow White their favorite Disney film. At least For those under the age of 40, or even 50, Snow White as a character is very basic. She's more representative of the tropes of the fairy tale than the actual fairy tale itself. The dwarves, while iconic, they're kind of funny little guys, but they're not really distinct characters the same way that Timon and Pumbaa are, or the genie from Aladdin. And while the evil queen is a memorable villain, there are other villains that do the same thing that she does, basically, but are more memorable, like Maleficent, like Lady Tremaine in Cinderella. Also, added to that, it's kind of hard to market it. Snow White is basically grouped in with the other Disney princesses, and by comparison, the other Disney princesses are unanimously more interesting than Snow White. If you put Snow White next to Cinderella, already, big difference in quality. Cinderella has an arc, she has difficulty she overcomes, she changes and grows, whereas Snow White, she's kind of the same character from the start of the story versus the end of the story. And forget bringing up Jasmine, Ariel, Belle, any of those characters are very well written and therefore not exactly easy to mesh with the rest of the Snow White aesthetic that they establish. As a result, Snow White isn't really anyone's favorite Disney film outside of the historical relevancy of Snow White as a film. And the animation, of course, is beautiful, it's amazing in that sense, but it's not a story that grabs audiences all that much today when so many other fairy tale adaptations have built off of Snow White to tell their own narrative that is distinct, interesting, and compelling all the same. Snow White is also more well known as the first full-length animated feature that Disney produced. And that's great. Historically, Snow White is one of the most important Disney films of all time, but historical relevance does not mean you want to watch it on a regular basis. On the other hand, Lilo and Stitch, the original animated film specifically, is, in my opinion, a vastly better story, with complicated, flawed characters finding acceptance in one another. There's a lot of beauty to the story that I think really resonates with an audience, especially a younger audience, and as a result, it becomes more fondly remembered. It's something that you need to see at a certain age, especially if you maybe have issues feeling you fit in, or maybe you feel like your negative actions reflect negatively on your personhood. There's a lot of elements of Lilo and Stitch that touch upon a very human note, whereas Snow White is more a fairy tale. It's more a grand story of black and white. It's not really human. It's not a very relatable story. Very few people have an evil stepmother who's a queen who wants to destroy your life because she's jealous of your beauty at the age of 14. You know, that's not really human. But a lot of people have families that struggle upon their own issues, that seem broken but are still together despite that brokenness. There's a lot of humanity to Lilo and Stitch that Snow White just doesn't have. Between the human narrative that's more recent in memory, that's more nostalgic for young people who are now having kids of their own, versus Snow White, I think it's more reasonable which one got the attention of audiences more. After all, the kids who grew up with Snow White are either grandparents or dead. So, you know, what are the parents going to take their kids to? Snow White or Lilo and Stitch, you know? Who knows? But the third reason, I think, is the most distinct. It's the one that is the biggest factor at play here. Lilo and Stitch has no competition. In an article for /film, BJ Colangelo pointed this out. This idea that Lilo and Stitch has no competition. I could read the article, but thankfully, BJ Colangelo herself made a TikTok about the article, so I'll just play a clip from that to tell you what she said.
Inspired by this week's discourse, I wrote an article titled, "The Fans Angry at the Live-Action Lilo and Stitch's Box Office Success Are Missing the Point." You can read this up on /film. In the article, I discussed that in a capitalist society, which we are forced to endure, a healthy competitive market forces studios, streamers, and corporations to reach a standard of quality to attract customers over their competitors. But when there is no direct competition, there is no motivation for a studio to reach a standard of quality. Lilo and Stitch ran pretty much unopposed. Of the true-to-form, child-friendly movies that came out this year, we had Dogman in January, Snow White in March, the Minecraft movie at the start of April, and The Legend of Ochi in the middle of April, but even that had a significantly more limited release compared to the other movies. And a point that I've made previously is that the movies being bad, so to speak, isn't even the real problem here. Like, we all consumed slop at some point as children. The difference is that because we had more options, there were movies and TV shows that were of high quality to offset some of that slop.
Back in the day, there used to be a ton of movies for families and kids. That used to be a pretty big market. And actually, what's funny is a lot of us made fun of how many they were and how cheap they were and how poorly made they were. Well, Lilo and Stitch is a bigger budget version of those lower budgety films, of those things we used to see all the time. And its success actually draws attention to these other films' absence. You might not be convinced, though. Let me show you something more visual. Here are every single film in the year 2002 made for families. This is the year Lilo and Stitch, the original, first came out. Look at the variety of films, different genres, different types. This counts, by the way, direct-to-video films as well. Now, this is 2025, the year that Lilo and Stitch, the live-action film, came out. This includes streaming. Compare them. Look at this for a second here. 2002, 2025. Bit of a difference, right? But these films don't exist anymore because of capitalism. Because, of course, it's capitalism. It's always capitalism in these videos. You should know half my conclusions of it's because businesses screwed the little guy over. As BJ Colangelo pointed out, very few movies came out for kids. You got Dogman, Snow White, Minecraft, Legend of Oshi, and that new Looney Tunes movie. These are the biggest films for kids that came out this entire year, and two of them were big budget films aimed to appeal to the 4-quadrant demographics. The biggest, most general audiences imaginable. 4-quadrant, for those of you who don't know, it's young and old, male and female. The Minecraft movie, interesting enough, was the best one in terms of box office. The silly, kind of chaotic movie that was unorthodox, that broke the mold, that got the most success. But the problem is, a lot of these other films are competing with Marvel, trying to draw in audiences of all ages, but forgetting kids. Now that wouldn't be too terrible if children's media on TV wasn't a total barren wasteland. Aside from Bluey, a show from Australia, what family cartoons are coming out that people are actually talking about, that they're showing their kids? Studios constantly revive shows from 2 or 3 decades ago, and often retool them for an older audience that grew up with them. Recently, there was a controversy over whether or not Sesame Street would exist.
Welcome back to Squawk Box. Sesame Street now looking for a new distribution partner after Warner Brothers Discovery decided not to renew its agreement to air new episodes of the show on HBO and its streaming platform Max. Max said that the decision is in part what they're calling a broader shift, corporate shift really, away from children's programming. Sesame Workshop partnered with HBO back in 2015, if you remember, granting the premium cable service a 9-month window of exclusivity before the episodes were broadcast for free on PBS. Under the deal, Sesame Street's season expanded to 35 episodes a year from 18. And thanks to that big cash infusion, it was able to do that. Now, Apple TV, Netflix, and Amazon have been mentioned as possible contenders to pick up the long-running series. What do you think?
Sesame Street, the perennial children's classic that helps people learn English and helps them learn so many important life lessons, almost was wasted on the vine because Warner Brothers Discovery didn't want to pay for it. They didn't see a profit in it, even though Sesame Street has never been a profitable show. It's been a public service because Jim Henson felt it was necessary to tell this story for the public, that this was a contribution to society. That's why he used public broadcasting and publicly funded television to distribute the show for so long. It was a show not designed to sell toys, although it did sell toys and products, but rather a show that existed to help society better itself. It was not there to make a profit, it was there to profit us. In the BJ Colangelo clip I shared, she blamed the Trump administration revoking certain bills as the reason why children's entertainment has dipped in quality so much.
And the reason that so many millennials feel very passionately about this is because we are children that grew up during the time of the Children's Television Act, which was introduced in 1990. While the act was absolutely imperfect, it did mandate that there would be core programming for audiences under 16 that would be specifically designed to serve the educational and informational needs. This mandate helped launch shows like Bill Nye the Science Guy or The Magic School Bus. But in 2019, the Trump administration essentially dismantled the Children's Television Act. Their justification is, oh, well, we need to incorporate the concept of streaming, completely forgetting that there are plenty of parents out there that can't afford to have a ton of streaming services and do depend on traditional broadcasting.
I have a different approach. It doesn't contradict that, but rather adds to that. Now, my personal pet theory, and you can argue this is not super accurate or what have you, is this trend of the decline of children's media. It really started with My Little Pony, Friendship is Magic. Bear with me on this one. This is a show I personally detest that apparently was hugely popular with older audiences my age, or older, 15 years ago when it came out. And predators, apparently. But the older people were the ones who paid for all the merchandise, who showed up at the cons, who would watch religiously. And the show increasingly catered to this older audience. They included jokes referencing The Big Lebowski, for example. What 4-year-old girl is going to know what The Big Lebowski is? But 35-year-old man? Oh, he'll get the joke. He'll think it's hilarious. See, that's the problem. The show started to move away and shift away from its target demographic. And as a result, it left kids behind in favor of adult audiences. Now, other shows have had adult audiences before that were aimed for younger people, sure. But I think My Little Pony was the most transparent about appealing to this demographic and the most high profile in the world of children's televised entertainment. A lot of animators who worked on My Little Pony worked on other projects as well. The other big project was Adventure Time, but I think Adventure Time still understood the chaotic energy needed for kids to enjoy it. It had an older demographic too, yes, but Adventure Time grew with its audience, dealing with more mature themes over its decade-spanning history. My Little Pony rapidly shifted gears within the first year of release, shifting from a show aimed for young kids to maybe something more adult-oriented. And that decision, I think, was detrimental to the animation industry as a collective whole. My Little Pony's success sparked a new wave of critics, many of whom are criticizing the Lilo Stitch movie right now. Those older cartoon critics geared their criticisms towards media for young audiences as though they were adult features. And young kids who were watching YouTube at the time internalized those messages. They began to look for more adult, more mature stuff at a young age. And the animation industry didn't hurt that by inviting them in. Because a lot of people who are now making cartoons were kids who grew up with the stuff that these critics also grew up with. So they had some kind of a similar mentality. And some of these shows worked and some of them didn't. Some shows remembered that they were still, at the end of the day, shows for families and kids, and grew with their audience over time, incorporating gradually more mature ideas. One example of this is Steven Universe. Other shows were made more for an older kid, young teen audience, like She-Ra and the Princess of Power, or Voltron. And these were darker, they were mature, but they were still identifiably kids' media. And both Steven Universe and She-Ra were in direct competition with popular anime at the time, like Attack on Titan, My Hero Academia, and as a result, they began kind of to be a bit of a pushback. Were you watching the anime or were you watching the cartoons? What's going on? You could just watch both, but who actually ends up being rational and just watching everything good? You gotta pick sides. And they would compete with each other in this sense. But then something happened. We kept going, you know? The shows that were becoming popular, they ran their course and ended. What we ended up seeing more and more were more adult-oriented animation projects. Rick and Morty, BoJack Horseman. And then there were nostalgia grabs that appealed to a new generation of children despite them being stuck on one streaming service. It's like everything Paramount Plus did with Nickelodeon's old cartoons. You know, everything on Paramount Plus, it's funny. You know, Fairly Odd Parents and SpongeBob SquarePants, they're over 2 decades long, but they turn a profit, so they keep regurgitating new versions of these stories to an audience who is increasingly distant from its first debut. Why make a new property that you can have your audience grow to love when you could just rework the old stuff for an immediate cheap profit? So rather than grow new talent and new IP, they want to just regurgitate the same stuff forever, even though after a certain amount of time, it reaches the Simpsons level of repetitive, zombie-like quality. The Simpsons used to be a distinct example of a cartoon that ran for too long and was starting to die out a slow, painful death from just fatigue. But now it's the name of the game. Now everything is Zombie Simpsons. And that's because studios are afraid to invest in a new property that's original and different and distinct unless it's geared towards an adult audience. Adults they think they can take a risk on, but children not so much, because that requires planning thought processes. And on TV, forget it. Time slots are essentially devoted to classic favorites because television as a medium is losing ground. David Zaslav's relentless annexation of all children's media on Warner Bros. Discovery platforms has made it even harder for kids to discover old classics. Right now on HBO Max, Courage the Cowardly Dog is the only Cartoon Network original show on there. Powerpuff Girls, gone. Dexter's Lab, gone. All these classics, gone. I'm sure you have Adult Swim, the adult cartoons are there, but the original children's classics that you could capitalize and get a new audience for, nope, they're gone. All of them annexed. Gone. No archival purposes. If you're a parent and wants to show their kid these old shows they grew up with, you can't do that. You have to dig to another streaming service. And it further isolates it. It further fragments the entertainment you can show families and kids. The situation for children's media right now is more dire than you might at first believe, because cartoons are being stripped away. And the classic stuff is being forgotten in favor of new product that they can then produce cheaply to market upon, if even that. There were threats for a while that the Looney Tunes would leave HBO Max, and this was the only place you could watch the Looney Tunes as part of a subscription service. And that's changed a little bit since then because of massive pushback, but it's still a factor at play. Oh, and by the way, that's just animation. We're not even touching upon the live-action shows for kids. Nickelodeon and Disney used to have a ton of these, but now they seem content to recycle established IPs and nothing else, taking fewer risks because, quite frankly, unlike back in the days of television, you can't just have a time slot for all the live-action shows anymore. The kids have to select these shows, and they can't just select them if they don't know they exist. And what better way to make them exist than have an established IP that parents will be familiar with and put on for their kids. Again, it's not geared for the kids, it's geared for the parents. Because a kid's not going to know what Drake and Josh is, not going to know what Wizards of Waverly Place is, but the parents will. And the parents will go, oh, I recognize that from when I was a kid. This would be good for my kid to watch. And they just put it on. It's not made with children in mind, it's made with parents in mind. To market it better to the audience paying for the subscriptions to these streaming services. The kids aren't just putting on the TV and letting the shows run their course and come to them. The kids have to go to the source. And who's paying for it? The parents. It's become part of the bundle package of streaming, not a part of the organic bundled package of cable, which is a very different beast. Because the children have to select the shows for themselves, studios are more picky about what they choose to produce. They can't just put in a time slot that's popular and see if kids gravitate towards it anymore. And that's resulted in a market geared almost entirely on identifiable intellectual property. And as a result, entire genres of children's media are now gone. They're not being produced anymore. Here's a question, and I'm going to cover this more in a later video this month. How many horror stories were made for kids? You used to have Goosebumps, Are You Afraid of the Dark, So Weird, Ghost Rider. Sure, they might get revivals, but these revivals are often shallow and geared toward older audiences, with all the silly parts shaved off in favor of something more slick and modern, more like a Scream movie than anything else. The Goosebump films are one of the biggest wasted opportunities I've seen because the first film did quite well. It just didn't do amazingly well. And their decisions following that resulted in the sequel getting cut in terms of budgets, and the third film being completely lost. Every family film has to be a mega blockbuster to be successful. Because outside the world of streaming, they can put a lot of money into it, and you gotta put it out there. But if it's in the world of streaming, these new entries get lost in the shuffle, because the streamer is not willing to pay the marketing budget to promote it to an audience who might overlook it. It's resulted in this weird ecosystem where only a few family films are made every year, and as a result, they gotta make bank. And if they don't make bank, they're a failure. And if they're a failure, they're relegated to streaming where they're quickly forgotten about in the shuffle of new content. And if they're straight to streaming in the first place, then they're completely eclipsed in the shuffle of content. You can't find it because the only things that stand out in streaming are whatever the first 5 biggest properties are that week. And if it's an old property for kids, limited window of audience, it is lost in the shuffle. And how can you find these classics? Well, you gotta talk to the tastemakers, the content filters, YouTube critics. And any story that dares push the boundaries will become a target of ire from either conservative slop reactors who fear that Steven Universe made their niece or nephew gay, or liberal slop reactors who express offense at challenging art that dares expose a dainty wrist or something. This hyperactive online sphere has created an environment where the only art that will be praised is cookie cutter and unchallenging. And even that seems to be a dire situation, as is the case with Lilo and Stitch. Lilo and Stitch is just different enough to stand out. It's a water bottle in the Sahara, because it did exactly what the movie did 24 years prior, only slightly worse. And granted, this is the same company that rejected the almost completed Nimona, which eventually became a nominee for Best Animated Feature at the Oscars, over everything else Disney made. But I digress. Disney, the corporate machine, has produced something that defies the corporate machine they've created. And it's the same model of creation they've used for the last 15 years. What a dire state we're in if that's the complimentary thing I'm paying the movie. What does that tell us about our society right now? Oh my god. Oh, saying that I didn't realize how dire that was till I said it out loud, but that's actually really disturbing. I'm actually really upset saying that. That Lilo and Stitch, one of the most marketed properties that Disney has, is just anti-corporate enough to stand out from the rest of the crowd. Oh my god, what are we doing here, man? Lilo and Stitch did not succeed because the film is particularly great. It's an okay film. It succeeded because we have created an environment where it just shouldn't exist. Ironically, Disney and their brand synergy resulted in a corporate product that stands out from the corporate crowd. And I hope its success leads to Disney changing gears a little bit, making more esoteric, odder films into live-action adaptations. Because they've exhausted the mainstream entries, so why not make a live-action Hunchback film or Treasure Planet? Why not bring back Atlantis: The Lost Empire? Those are nostalgic enough for younger audiences where you can watch it again. They're going to do Moana and Tangled probably, because that's the safe bet, but I would like to see some stranger films get made. And any original films should be made, but they won't be, because audiences have to show with their wallet that original works are not to be ignored. And if you have any doubts that we're going to screw up these original properties, look to see how Elio, the new Pixar film, is tracking at the box office. It's looking to get a fraction of what Lilo and Stitch did in its first weekend. We are going to fail this movie because it is not a recognized IP, and it's going to slip through the public attention. It also doesn't help that Disney is barely marketing it, but hey, it's a combination of factors here. They're not marketing it because they have no faith in it, because they realize the public will not show up to an original film. Not a sequel, not a remake or a spin-off, but a original, complete film. Audiences are afraid to take a risk. They'd rather wait for it to go on streaming. I just want to reiterate this is kind of our faults too. We refuse to talk about media that doesn't hit the nail on the head without special interests. And that's a damn shame. Because it's that mentality that has resulted in stuff like Lilo and Stitch being standout, being distinct, even though it is just a regurgitation of what we had over 20 years ago and better. We do not reward original filmmaking for families anymore. There used to be a whole market. There used to be whole lines of straight-to-video collections. And granted, a lot of that was slop, not that great, but there was some good stuff in there too. There used to be a whole bunch of films made every year for families. Every month there was a new film you could take your kids to. But now that's gone. We have allowed the market to become 4-quadrant centered only, or Oscar art film only. Kids are the biggest victim of the new cinematic landscape, because the films that they could enjoy are now gone. It's no wonder why kids are an increasingly small sliver of the audience that films market towards. Because We focus too much on teenagers, focus too much on young adults. That 14 to 38 demographic. That's what studios now focus on, as opposed to kids, families. Used to be a big market, now it's gone. They just wait for the new Disney film and that's about it. It's disappointing. It's very sad. And unfortunately, it's only going to get worse because studios have made films for kids that are high quality. Transformers 1, for example, a very good film aimed towards general audiences that died. Families were like, oh, I'll wait for it to come on streaming. It wasn't marketed all that well. It wasn't really clear what it even was. Was it in the same line of films as the Michael Bay Transformers films? What's going on? General audiences wouldn't know, and as a result, the film got lost in the shuffle. We need to be more mindful of this because as we grow, as the film industry changes, we need to make sure that children are not forgotten. We cannot forget family entertainment because it is a backbone of cinema. In the 80s, 90s, even 2000s, there were so many great films aimed for young audiences that we then took with us as we grew older, that we have nostalgia for. And there is a hunger for it. Look at TikTok. They have all these little trends about, oh, you remember this old nostalgic film you used to watch? I bet no one's ever seen this one. They used to feel like hidden gems. Secrets you could explore and experience, but now they're totally gone. There is nothing left. There is nothing left of an entire industry, an entire marketplace, because it has become corrupted by the corporate slot machine. We need to regain this. We need to refocus on it. Put our eyes back on the ball where it counts. Because we cannot expect a new generation of cinematic enjoyers to exist if there's nothing there outside of Disney to draw young audiences in. We need other voices. We need new voices. And without new voices coming in to replace the old, to create new content, without them getting a chance to tell their stories because the corporations don't see the financial value of it, we will lose a massive cornerstone of the entertainment industry.
Kids will love this movie, Disney adults will love this movie, but as someone who really, really loves the original Lilo and Stitch, this movie is dreadful. It is missing all of what made it so well remembered. It is a prime case of missing the forest for the trees the whole way through.